This is the DJP UPDATE Podcast Series, showing the passion of individuals for pursuits outside of their profession or employment. Enjoy. Today we're talking with Dr. Richard Anderson, a medical oncologist who is also the chair and CEO of a leading medical liability company headquartered in Napa. Dr. Anderson, what is your passion outside of medicine and business and family?
It's really two things combined, wilderness travel and photography. And I'm happiest when I'm taking photographs in the wilderness.
Why do you think this became your passion?
I've been doing each for a very long period of time, and I enjoyed each of them. They're quite different, but when I started to put the two of them together, I found a real passion. Wilderness travel has always been something I've enjoyed. I grew up with my family in the era when many men worked 50 weeks a year, would take 2 weeks off, and the 2 weeks that my father had off each year, we would go camping as a family. And I remember those camping trips as really the highlight of the year, of our year as a family. And so I remember those very fondly. Didn't do a whole lot of that kind of thing after I left home in college and in medical school. But once I started practicing, most of my vacations were hiking and rafting trips. And I found in the wilderness an overwhelming sense of both beauty and a sense of infinity, and really almost a sense of the divine. And so I found my temple really was really in the wilderness.
Go ahead.
At the same time, I learned, my father had been an avid photographer, but interestingly enough, although he taught me a love of camping, he didn't teach me about photography. I just was aware of his love for photography, and he took lots of pictures of the family. But I actually learned to use a camera myself in medical school, and photography became a hobby. And when I started and I used to take general pictures, as many photographers do, of whatever was around, and they would be of variable quality, some good, some bad, some family pictures. You'd go around, as some photographers do, and take macro pictures in a junkyard and so on and so forth. Would be aware of the use of cameras in our medical settings. But when I started to take the cameras on my wilderness journeys and had the ability to start to get to places that were inherently beautiful, and then to study them through the viewfinder, and to take and to undergo the discipline and the experience that the craft requires. You need to pause, you need to slow down. In those settings, you often put the camera on a tripod, and instead of watching the world flow by at the rate of flow, you're now seeing it very, very slowly at one frame, in one frame. And in that, I found great joy and pleasure. And it also allows me to bring the trip home, because in this era of digital photography, the photographic part of it starts, of course, with the capturing of the image. But I spend many happy hours sitting at my computer processing the now thousands of files that one takes back from a major trip. And so I enjoy that process. And then out of that, maybe I get 25 photographs, maybe I get more, maybe I get less, that I really love, but those become my trophies. Those are my permanent mementos of those trips. And the fact that I've been able to go from the actual experience itself, which is magnificent in that time, in that place, in that moment, to the process of capturing it with a camera, putting it into a computer file, creating a finished image, putting that image on a website or making a print, and then I do my own framing most of the time, framing the print. It's an incredibly satisfying process.
So tell me about some of the places you have visited. No doubt many places, but tell me some of your favorite places that you've done photography.
When I was earlier in my medical career, some of my medical friends and I would do quite a bit of whitewater rafting and quite a bit of hiking. And I lived in California, practiced in California, in San Diego, and most of our trips were in the American Southwest. And so we hiked and rafted throughout much of Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and a little bit in some other places as well. And those were my initial independent wilderness experiences, and then we repeated them many, many times over several decades, so probably several dozens of trips emerging. And those were my first travels. Later, as my family was grown up and had time to do independent travel and the means to do travel further afield, I've been able to photograph in a lot of beautiful places around the world, from the Arctic to Antarctica, from Iceland to the Galapagos Islands, and a lot of beautiful places in between. So I have been very fortunate, I think, to be in a position to, there's so many ways in which the world is a scary place, but there's also hopefully an even larger number of ways in which it's an incredibly beautiful place. And I've had the opportunity to experience lots and lots of moments of surpassing physical beauty on these trips.
So, of all of the thousands of photographs that you've done, which photograph would you say is my favorite or among my favorites?
Yeah. It's interesting that you asked me this today, because just this week I've hung the two largest enlargements I've ever made, 40 by 60 inches, and I had them printed on canvas. So it's my photograph, but on canvas, and I hung them this week. And so that selection process in choosing them made me have to ask myself the same question that you just asked. And one of them is from Antarctica, and the other is from Iceland. The one from Antarctica, for normal people, as opposed to, say, not Shackleton, not Reinhold Messner, but normal people, if you're going to visit Antarctica, you're going to be on a ship. And once you're on the ship, and these are smaller cruise ships, usually 100 to 200 passengers, and they're ice hardened, but they're not icebreakers usually. And then you go ashore in Zodiacs, and you go ashore several times a day, and as often as conditions will allow. And on one of those many trips, in a Zodiac in Antarctica, we were cruising among the icebergs themselves, which means that I was really eye to eye with the iceberg, but eye to eye from sea level. So I'm really have my perspective sitting on the Zodiac, I'm a foot or so out of the water, not much more than that. So I'm really at eye level to the iceberg, and between me, and we're quite close, because you can get quite close in a Zodiac. So there's a few feet of Southern Ocean, and then the iceberg, the waves lapping on the iceberg, and so you see the water breaking onto the base of the iceberg, which has its colors. And then the ice, the thing that's so amazing about Antarctica is the almost infinity of color that's there. You expect it to be all white and all gray, and there is a lot of that. but then that provides an incredible backdrop for the color that's actually there. And the color is usually in the ice or snow. The different densities of the ice and the lichen, amazingly enough, that grow in the snow, provide, and the ice, it refracts light differently. And so the thickness of the ice affects the way the light is refracted through it. And so you get incredible shades of blue as the wavelength of light that most gets through, but varying shades depending on the actual density of the light, of the ice, and the way the ice is striking it. And then you have the reflection of that in the water. And so this scene for me just is one of those serendipities of nature where the motion of the iceberg, the motion of the wave, the kinetic action of the water breaking on the iceberg, the colors of the ice, the light coming through, and then the form that it took in actuality was just surpassingly beautiful. And then one click, and there it is. And then I was able to take that home and make an image of it, and now have it on the wall right outside where we're speaking right now. And the second image, also interestingly enough, in a cold place. I think, have an affinity for kind of cold beauty. I'm not a real kind of tropical guy. And so I like cold places, and I like the beauty that's often created by ice and snow. So on this occasion, Alice and I had the great privilege of being in an ice cave, a glacial ice cave. So this is a cave inside a glacier carved out by a glacial river, which is carving out the cave. And we arrived there, drove for about an hour outside of Reykjavik, and in a 4x4, got within a couple of 100 yards of the entrance to the cave, and then hiked up to the cave entrance, and then lowered ourselves, with several other people, lowered ourselves down into the cave. So now we're standing below the mouth of the ice cave, totally surrounded by ice. If you could, I would. It's not like an igloo because it's huge. It's you have to really think of a true cave. And again, the cave it's being carved by the active river, which is flowing right at our feet, but it's carving through layers and layers and layers and layers of ice. And so all of the densities are different. And so the varying thicknesses of the ice are present in what is really a living sculpture. So it's beautiful, but then something really magnificent happened, and that is sunrise. So one nice thing about Iceland in winter is that sunrise is at 10 o'clock in the morning. So we're in the cave, the sun crests the horizon, and the cave is full just of yellow light. So, and it's flowing through the opening in the dome of the cave that we came through, but it's also, parts of the cave are translucent. And so the cave, the ice is being transilluminated by this yellow, warm sunrise light, and the various thicknesses of the ice create different shadings. And it really was, it was very much akin to a religious experience. There was just an overwhelming sense of something really magnificent happening. Just awe-inspiring. And what was happening was sunrise. And it was happening in an isolated place on Earth where normally there wouldn't be any human observers. People would come to this cave occasionally, but by and large, it was an isolated cage, randomly created by winter melting of the glacier. So this was a transient phenomenon. The cave, I think it was a Greek philosopher who said that no man can set foot in the same river twice, and you could really see that as the cave is actually being molded from nature magnificent creation, and then it disappears. And so we're in this really sacred kind of place, and then the universe, literally, it feels like the universe then turns on the sun, and it was really awe-inspiring. And I was there with lots of camera gear and took dozens and dozens and dozens of pictures. In that moment, I was inspired by what I was feeling and horrified by the thought that I wouldn't capture it adequately with my camera. And so I took an embarrassingly large number of photographs, but each of them has become really a treasured memento, and one of those is hanging right outside the room. So that's a very long answer to your question, but those would be my two favorites.
Well, no interview would be complete when the subject is photography unless I asked you what is your favorite camera gear, and do you have manual settings when you work, or do you use it on automatic, and under what circumstances do you use one or the other?
Right. Well, that's a great question. I've owned cameras really since medical school, and historically, I would say that the camera that I felt closest to over all of these years was the Olympus OM2, which was a film camera. It was kind of the height of Olympus's film cameras. Had a very elegant and somewhat complex spot meter, and was really an elegant jewel of a photographic instrument. But with my aging eyes, the absence of autofocus, which was becoming available in Canon and Nikon cameras, but not yet in Olympus, led me to switch to the Canon system. And I used the Canon system with excellent autofocus quite happily for 20 or more years. And then odd personal circumstances in which my camera equipment, all of my camera equipment was in one place, and that place became submerged in water. So I had to replace the whole system. And at that time, for a variety of reasons, I chose the Nikon system, and I've been using that for the last 7 or 8 years. And so again, a very long answer to your question. My current camera, which I love, really love, is a Nikon D750. But the truth is, it's pretty hard to find a bad camera today. And I'm relatively agnostic about Nikon versus Canon. Once you start with one, there's really no particular reason why you need to switch would be my impression of it.
So the shots that you took that you consider your favorite, those were done handheld?
The one in Antarctica was handheld in the Zodiac, yes. You're right. The Zodiac would be a really good example of a place where you can't use a tripod.
Right.
But the one in the ice cave was a really good example of where you needed to use a tripod. There was zero hope. There wasn't enough light. So there was zero hope of hand-holding the exposures because the exposures were 2 or 3 seconds. So the tripod was absolutely critical. I mean, I think it's kind of a commonplace thing to say, but that the single best piece of equipment that almost anybody can invest in to improve their photography is a tripod. But having said that, they're hard to use. They're not as much fun to use. They do slow you down. But if you do invest the time and the effort to master that tool, it also brings a lot of pleasure in and of itself because it does slow you down. And instead of rapid firing through hundreds of images, it slows you down. It makes you take individual frames. And it allows you to take some photographs which, even with today's technology, just can't be done handheld.
So is there anything else you'd like to add regarding photography and travel to exotic places?
Well, I guess the only thing I would say is, and I'll respond to a question that is kind of that many people ask me in this question, in this question about photography, which is, doesn't the photography get in the way of your experiencing these beautiful places? And I would say to that question that there probably are 2 kinds of people in the world. One for whom the answer is yes, and one for whom the answer is no. And for me, it's no. The photography incredibly increases my appreciation of it. Because in a sense, I'm looking, whether I have the camera at eye level or not, I'm looking for photographs. I'm looking for great moments. It means that I'm entirely present, I'm focused in what I'm seeing, and I'm trying to see and process that as I'm experiencing it, instead of just kind of watching the world go by. And so for me, photography vastly enhances the experience, and then has the wonderful advantage of allowing me, it's sort of like putting lightning in a bottle, because I can then capture that moment and take it home with me.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Richard Anderson. And now we lead Dr. Richard Anderson on another adventure as he paraglides over the Swiss Alps. Dr. Richard Anderson's copyrighted photographs can be found on the web at richardandersonmd.zenfolio.com.